Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Your time and presence are greatly appreciated. So we welcome you all to the first session for the BSc Historical Criminology Network's Winter 2023-24 seminar series, Meet the Authors. So we have a full roster of programs with other sessions in December and then in 2024. The point of these sessions is to bring together research in progress, research completed, and research published. And each of these labels or terms is meant to indicate a certain level of participation. So typically, one of the reasons why I came up with this is because I've had questions from participants who have asked, I want to contribute, I want to participate, but my research is in progress, or my research has been completed but has not been published, or my research has been published but has been published for a while, it's just not gotten much traction. So what the sense that I want to convey is that this platform is for research in the realm of criminology that deals with history. And so whether your research is in progress or completed or published, it is still relevant. And so we welcome conversation with you with the research that you have. So today we have Dr. Mary Fraser, and Mary's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She comes to us today from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow, where she's also a researcher in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Today, her presentation titled British Policemen and Their Role in the Food Crisis During the Great War, 1917 to 1918. So police as Ploughmen. It's a book that is forthcoming in 2024 with Palgrave Macmillan. So Mary pursues research in historical criminology, including a focus on policing in the First World War. Today's session is recorded. So if you're not comfortable with this, I invite you to use the anonymity functions. For instance, you can use your screens, so you can go behind the wall, and you can use the chat function for communication. I would say, before we get started, as a starting point, I'd like to take the opportunity to remind everyone of the need for self-awareness in how we treat the space. So the aim is to establish a safe space for intellectual exchange. So please be mindful and treat each other with respect and dignity as a starting point for conversation, for whatever feedback you have to offer, which we completely welcome. This is the point of having a platform such as this, so we can have a conversation back and forth. The aim is for these sessions to be interactive between speakers and audiences. So there are a number of ways that this can take place. So as a starting point, I would say that the main thing to keep in mind is that participation would take place after the speaker has presented. So in this regard, you can use either the chat function or the hand raise function. So you can jot down your thoughts in the chat, and as the moderator, I'll read out and get Mary to respond to the questions or the issue that you've raised. Or you can raise your hand and ask Mary directly the question that you have in mind. So there's that. Another interesting thing, actually, that I have found useful, and also based on feedback from having had this series of talks in previous years, is that it'd be really interesting to know where you're tuning in from. Because one of the reasons this platform is a useful one is because it gets us to overcome some of the barriers for participation, which we have increasingly been faced with in academia, which is the issues with borders. So having to travel somewhere for a talk, but not being able to travel because of restrictions with border control issues, but also because of time constraints, work load issues and such. Having the opportunity to have a virtual conversation where you can log in from wherever is most convenient is actually really useful. So if you can write where you're coming from in the chat, that would be really useful. You can also write your interest in the historical topic. So are you using this moment to think about teaching, research, or a combination of the two? That's also quite useful to know, to get a sense of why this platform is useful. So having said that much, I think this is a good opportunity to turn the floor over to Mary, so she can carry on with her participation, with her presentation, and that we can enjoy the actual content of the session. Mary, do you want to take away?
Thanks very much, Rosemary. Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Yes.
And hopefully this will work. Yes, there we are.
Yes, I can see.
Let's
Very
just
clearly.
see if, is that all right? Can you see that
Yes.
all right?
Very, very clearly, yes.
Great. Okay. So thanks very much, Rosemary, for the introduction. And as you're asking other people to say where they're from, I'm doing this from home in Glasgow.
Mhm.
So, I hope that other people are looking forward to discussing this with me. I'd be really interested in people's comments. I should say that, as I've indicated, the book is forthcoming round about the middle of next year. So I'm at the stage where I'm on the penultimate chapter at the moment. So this is an ideal time to discuss this, because I'm really keen to get people's feedback on how it seems, because if necessary, I can make amendments to the text and add your contributions. So it would be very welcome.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, so my work involves exploring the work of the police in different time periods, and I'm currently completing these investigations on what the police did during the First World War. And what my aim for police history is that I want the police as an organization and as individuals to be able to say, history tells us that, whatever the issue is at the moment. And I've never heard the police saying that. So I want to provide examples of how the police, given certain situations, would be able to say, history tells us that.
Okay.
So this is an example of what history tells us about police work. And at the end, I want to share with you how I think this can be used in a modern context. What I'm going to talk with you about can be used in a modern context. So I found a role in the food crisis of the Great War. Not only before I started to do this did I not know that there was a food crisis in the Great War, but also I had no idea that the police were involved. And so I found this a particularly interesting area of investigation. And I'm really pleased to be able to share it with you and hope that you'll be intrigued by it as well.
Okay.
So let's go on to the first slide. Are we okay so far?
Yes, so far so good.
Right. Okay, so the first slide sets out what I want to do in this presentation. So there's 5 areas. One is, what was the food crisis and how did it arise? The second one was, what did police do about it? Because I had no idea that the police would actually be involved in such things as a food crisis. The third area is, how many would be involved and where were they from? The fourth area is, why was it important? Why were they important in this context? And lastly, how can we relate this to today? So starting off about what was the food crisis in 1917, 1918. I want to show you what led up to police involvement, as it's necessary to understand this in order to see why the police were needed and what the crisis was. So the first area that I've put up is blockade of food imports. So German submarines were started to blockade British imports of food from late 1916. But from the 1st of February 1917, they said they were going to have a knockout blow against Britain to sink as many ships as they possibly could. They built a huge number of more submarines in order to do this, to blockade Britain for this to exert this knockout blow. And this was because they were failing in the war. Their population was increasingly starving, and they were increasingly rioting because of shortage of food. So they feared that they were going to lose the war, and this was one way that they felt that they could gain the upper hand. So by Germany sinking an increasing number of ships bringing food to Britain, this was going to create a huge problem for us. We had a huge number of imports. For example, we were reliant on 81% of wheat that came from Argentina, America, Canada, from which we made bread. And a huge number of other imports as well, of all sorts of things, meat, fruit, vegetables, even aerated water we imported. And particularly wheat was important because it was a staple diet for the mass of the population. The only thing that Britain didn't import was potatoes, and I want to come to why that's important in a few minutes. So from the beginning of February 1917, increasing food shortages became evident in the shops and in the markets. And it also led to huge price inflation. So not only were the population seeing these food shortages, but they also saw through the newspapers, and this comes on to the section which says increasing paranoia, possible starvation, that the newspapers were publishing figures and columns about the shipping losses, increasing shipping losses. And you can see from the Birmingham Gazette on the front page was saying more admissions but no figures. And what this started to tell the population is that they weren't sure whether the government was actually telling them the whole truth about the number of ships being sunk, and whether in fact things were likely to get a whole deal worse than just a few items not being so regularly available. And these sorts of columns were published nationwide. So the other issue was that papers started to publish reports about food riots in combatant nations. So this came from Germany, from Italy, from France. There started to be food riots because their populations weren't so well served. Germany, for example, was only concerned with feeding the troops. It wasn't concerned with feeding the local population. So you start to see things like German food riots. 28 people reported killed and 270 injured. Now, this is a big riot. This isn't just a small disturbance. This is a big riot, published on the 3rd of May in the Westminster Gazette and also in other newspapers around Britain. So here was the fear of starvation looming large. We were starting to see that the British public was starting to get really worried about all this. And it wasn't only that this was a worrying example overseas and starting to occur here. This was the 3rd year of the war. So Britain had already been at war for 2 years. They were receiving horrifying reports of troops being killed and, you know, mass fighting without an end in sight. So they were already war weary, and now seeing that food imports were starting to be diminished and likely possible starvation in the country was terrifying for the people. So, but it wasn't only a problem of food supplies coming into Britain, it was also a problem of food produced in this country. So one of the issues that was developed, and this is where I talk in the last of these headlines, British potato famine, is that there was an attempt by government to preserve British food supplies, British food stocks. And what the food controller did was to fix prices. So what the government did was to say, we will buy all the produce and we will sell it to the retailers. So one thing that Britain was producing in vast quantities, about 96 to 98% of our potatoes that we ate were produced in Britain. The food controller set a maximum price for the sale of potatoes. And at that price, the farmers said they couldn't possibly sell them. So the farmers stopped selling them to the government, withdrew them. Also, it was a very poor winter. So there was quite a lot of potato disease. And when they were dug up, quite a lot were seen to be unfit for sale. So not only was there a shortage, but also the farmers refused to sell. And so you saw from the middle of February an increasing potato famine. And the newspapers called it a potato famine. And you started to see people protesting in the main squares. There was a protest in the centre of Glasgow, for example, women, a large number of women meeting in George Square, protesting outside the council offices about the lack of potatoes and the difficulty of finding them. And potatoes were completely unavailable until June, when the new crop came onto the market. But even then, in June, this was at inflated prices. So from February to June, not only was the problems of lack of a wide variety of products in the shops and markets, and government trying to get people to eat less bread because of the problem of wheat imports, but also there was now no potatoes as well. So this is a serious, serious situation for the nation. So the next slide I want to show you is what the Board of Agriculture did about it. Because unlike Germany, Britain did become very involved in leading government, in leading food supplies. So the Board of Agriculture, the president of the Board of Agriculture was Roland Prothero, and he decreed that Britain must become self-sufficient in food. And it wasn't just to be any food, it was to be crops. And I'll show you why in just a moment. But this was urgent, and I'll show you the urgency of this in just a few minutes. And he made the argument that crops fed more people than pasture land. So this next slide shows you his argument. So his argument was that regardless of the good or poor grass that fed the cattle, you couldn't feed any more than 40 people for a year on cattle by raising and killing cattle. However, if you grew wheat and other bread products, rye and oats, you could feed 10 times more people. And if you grew potatoes on the same acreage, you could feed 400 people. So this was why it was important that the land was ploughed up. No longer was it appropriate to graze cattle on pasture land. The land now needed to be ploughed up, so land that had gone out of use, land that was given over to pasture, even things like golf courses and various parks were ploughed up and sown with corn and potatoes to feed the nation in this overwhelming attempt to feed the nation. But it wasn't just any time that this could be done. It was really urgent. And here you see an advert in the middle of February, and this was a half column in local and national newspapers about the urgency to plough up the land. And you can see that there's only 6 weeks given to sow the seed for this year's harvest. An urgent call to all who can plough. And I'll come on to the later half of this advert, employers asking employees to release their employees. I'll come on to that in a few minutes. So what the Board of Agriculture did in order to help farmers to produce more products, grain and potatoes, was that they decentralized farming. They decentralized the Board of Agriculture to local war agricultural executive committees. And these were based on local authority areas. And they introduced drastic compulsory measures on farmers to plough up their land, and penalties for non-compliance through Defence of the Realm Act 2L and 2M. And what they did was to bring in surveyors. So the surveyors with the farmers went round and surveyed in the local districts, surveyed the farms, surveyed the fields, and actually sent then instructions to the farmers as to what they were to do with their fields. So you saw the very detailed instructions to farmers. For example, field 27, plough up and sow with potatoes. Field 124, plough up and sow with wheat. And these were sent widely to farmers with instructions on each field or plot of land. So in order to plough the land at this time, I'm going back now to 2 slides beforehand. I showed this rather glamorous picture of the tractor ploughing up the land. Well, in actual fact, things weren't like that. Tractors were very novel in those days. Petrol-driven tractors were very novel. There were large numbers that were imported into the country. Canada gave 100. And there were also large numbers, other numbers that were imported into the country. But there were so many different varieties, and nobody quite knew which sort of ground would be most suitable for which sort of tractor. But when they were tried out, they constantly broke down and spare parts were difficult to get. So although tractors were a glamorous way of thinking about it, in actual fact, tractors had very little sway in helping farmers to plough up the land. So most farming, most ploughing was done by hand ploughs. Pulled by horses, the traditional way of ploughing the land. But ploughing was a skilled occupation. It wasn't just anyone that could do the ploughing, because you probably know, if you've seen a plough, that the plough have ploughshares, and these are the metal pieces which dig right into the ground, and you have to dig them into the ground about a foot and pull them along in order for it to turn the ground over. So that you can plant crops. And also, the other part of the skill of the ploughman is that you've got to be able to control the horses sufficiently so that they'll pull the plough along at a rate that you can cope with. And I don't know whether any of you have ever seen the film War Horse, but this is a brilliant film.
Yeah.
And you can see the young guy who had such trouble actually controlling the horse to get the field ploughed. And this was exactly the problem that you had if you were inexperienced in ploughing. And of course, there was no time at that point to train anybody else, you know, who wasn't familiar with working the plough. It needed to be done immediately. So let's just go back to this. And what I'm now ready to talk about is what the policemen did in relation to this food crisis. So who was going to do the ploughing in this 6-week window to save the nation from starvation. Farmers were willing to do this, but in actual fact, many of their best young workers had gone to war. And as you probably know, at this point, the military age was 18 to 41. So these would have been young, fit, experienced men who'd gone to war. And they said farmers simply couldn't do what was required unless they got a huge import of manpower. The other factor to notice is that if you have pasture land which grazes cattle, it needs less manpower than if you're going to plough up your fields and plant crops. That needs an increase in manpower. So where were these large numbers of additional staff going to come from? There was no time to train anyone else, so ploughmen had to be found from the existing population. And one identified source, which was identified by a number of different local authorities, is policemen. They knew that policemen had latent skills from previous agricultural work. So what I want to show you now is an example of how this is the case. This is Glasgow's police personnel records. And you can see that the total number that I've picked out is 398. This accounted for about a third of Glasgow policemen. And you can see the huge numbers that were farm servants. Now, farm servants would have been able to plough because they were multi-skilled. But also, there were quite large numbers of ploughmen and decreasing numbers of other farm workers, all of whom would be able to be competent in farm work. So this represents a third of Glasgow police, and in fact, this isn't unusual because Clive Emsey also found that many police forces had similar proportions of policemen from agricultural backgrounds. So policemen at this time had been recruited on height and chest measurements because their profile as a large man was important as an authority figure on the streets. Also, the police particularly recognized that the rural areas were said to have particularly suitable men for police work, particularly because of their robust physique, but also because of their aptitude to accept authority. So they were likely to bow to strict discipline and be easily molded due to their deference and their perseverance. So the physique and strength needed to work as a policeman was also essential to keep the ploughshares in the ground, to actually turn particularly wet soil in the early spring, heavy soil, to turn the soil in order to plant crops. So their latent skills as ploughmen were ideal in this national emergency. So let's go back again to this number 3 now. How many were involved? What I did was to look through not only the Police Review and Parade Gossip, which was the most widely used journal by the police at the time, but also local newspapers and archival work. And I found that these were the locations in which policemen were released. So a wide range of different areas that where policemen were released in England and in Scotland. I didn't find any in Wales, which was interesting, and I'm not quite sure why. But you can see that there were county forces such as Cheshire and Norfolk, and also borough forces such as Birmingham and Liverpool. and, Preston. So there's a mixture. of the release of policemen. The numbers are approximate, only by 1 or 2, because some sources, I think, published reports saying that these were the number of policemen that had been identified and were willing to volunteer for the work. Other reports said these are the number of policemen that have been released and are placed on the farms. So there's a difference of 1 or 2 in some of these areas. And where the sign shows a query, well, I simply couldn't find any numbers in any of the sources. So one thing I want to point out about this is that policemen were released before other groups. So, for example, the Women's Land Army didn't really start work until early 1918. This is April 1917 on the screen. And also prisoners of war. There was no agreement that prisoners of war would be released into agriculture until later in 1917. So in this context, the police acted as first responders in this national crisis. So the last one of these queries that I had was, why were policemen important in this context? So in this national crisis, the army also lent soldiers, and they'd been lending smaller numbers of soldiers from the end of 1916. And you could see that they'd been gradually increasing in numbers, going to the farms to help the farmers. But when the national crisis occurred in February 1917, the army released far more soldiers into agriculture. But sadly, for the farmers, many of them were found to have no knowledge of farming whatsoever. There were reports later on, when an inquiry into this came about and was published, that men were sent who had been previous lift attendants or previous piano tuners. And of course, you know, they were completely hopeless. As the farmers said, they didn't know one end of the pitchfork from the other. Also, there were soldiers sent who hadn't been carefully selected, who the farmers said were either lazy and useless or physically unable. So all these men were returned to the army depots around Britain, to their army depots, saying that simply the farmers couldn't be doing with this. You know, they simply weren't going to be any good, and they would drain on their resources rather than a help. One farmer complained that he was keeping an infirmary rather than actually having any help from his soldier who was sent to him. And this shows you this slide shows you how the army actually dealt with these men. And this was reported in the Scotsman at the time, although it was also published far more widely. So farmers felt really quite cheated at this point, because they'd released their sturdy, fit men, competent farm workers, into the army, because they'd been promised that they would receive replacements, substitutes, who would not be as able as their own workers, of course, but at least they'd be pairs of hands that would be useful. So when these people arrived, who were either lazy and useless or physically unable or simply had no idea how to do the work, farmers felt really cheated that they'd received these sorts of men in exchange. So policemen in this first wave of help for agriculture were ideal. They were carefully chosen by their chief constable as having the skills that were needed, and also the physique that was strong enough to be able to conduct the work. So they were immediately able to be deployed and to help. And many of the locations, such as Birmingham, made special arrangements for the police. They continued with police contracts of employment. They continued, if they were injured at work, to get help with their injuries. They were given overalls to protect their clothing. Generally, they were very well looked after and well respected by the farmers. Also, Birmingham and many other local authorities as well released them to the farmers and continued to pay the police wages. So the farmers weren't paying for additional staff to do the work. So one thing that we might well want to consider is whether the farmers were willing to do this work or whether there was resistance to actually ploughing up their pasture land. I said initially that farmers were willing, but not all of them actually were. And there were three examples where they weren't. One was in Cheshire, and Cheshire is traditionally a pastureland county where the cattle were raised for meat, milk, and cheese. And farmland had been improved over the generations, and farms were handed down over the generations. So they were very proud of their produce that came from the land. And so they were very reluctant to plough up their land to plant crops. There were also tensions in Berwick, Roxburgh, and Selkirk, which is on the borders, and also in Norfolk, where farm labourers were unionised. I mean, the unions didn't have a stronghold, but they did have farm labourers did have the union to fight their case. And what they were concerned about was the paying conditions. They were fighting for increased pay. But if they were given increased pay, they didn't want to have to work increased hours for it because the hours were long anyway. So what you can imagine is that policemen, while they were working on the land in a competent manner, ploughing the land, would also be an authority figure, helping to ensure that the Board of Agriculture policies were actually being carried out. In fact, whereas initially soldiers were criticised, policemen actually received praise from farmers, and farmers wrote to the local newspapers about the help that their policemen had given, and also some letters were sent to the war agricultural committees about the policemen, the work of the policemen. Now, what I also discuss is each of these local areas, and I have an idea of the number of the extent of the police force in each of these different areas, and approximately the proportion of police that were given from the police force into agriculture. So, for example, Birmingham gave 100 policemen, round about 100. That was a small proportion. That was probably 5%, 10% of their total complement of staff, of policemen. Whereas if you look at Berwick, Roxburgh, and Selkirk, their 40 policemen in that county accounted for 63%, a staggering 63% of the police force in that area. And equally, some other areas, Cheshire, that was quite a large proportion of the county force, 25, nothing like the 60% of Berwick. So I discuss the reasons that it might be that larger or smaller proportions were released into agriculture. So the policemen were released full-time. The only place that I found that policemen weren't released full-time was in Liverpool, and that they were allowed to go and work in their off-duty periods. But the rest of the areas, they were released from police duties full-time. And this was on condition that most of them worked close to home, so that if there was a national crisis, then they could be recalled to police duties to actually deal with the crisis. We don't know how many of them actually returned to police duties and when they returned. but most of them were released for around 2 months. And there's just two examples of when the police returned. One was in Edinburgh, when they were said to, the 50 of them were said to be back by June to police work. And the other area was Birmingham, where 86 was still on the land at the end of the war. And they'd been there throughout the war from March, April 1917, worked continuously on the land.
Okay.
So, last thing that I want to consider is, can we relate this to today? And what I've found is that I think we can. Have a look at this and see what you think. I'll give you a couple of minutes in which to have a look at that.
Hmm.
So this takes you back, doesn't it? I mean, I'd not
Yeah.
realized how serious this was. This was
Yeah.
published in the iNews on the 8th of January, 2021. And it appears to me that the release of policemen in times of crisis, policemen with appropriate skills in times of national crisis, is actually a legitimate role for the police. For example, the height of the pandemic in London, when ambulance drivers were either off sick or self-isolating, and the service was in fear of collapse. So on just one day, instead of receiving around 5,500 calls, the ambulance service received around 8,000 calls, and 5,500 was on a busy day, and it well exceeded the number of emergency calls. So in these circumstances, the police were released as ambulance drivers for a short while until the crisis abated and mass vaccinations occurred, starting with health service personnel. So I think you can see from this example that the police could say, history shows us that police were released before in the national crisis of potential population starvation in 1917, 1918. So I hope you feel that that's a reasonable example.
Yeah.
So I've shown that that this is a book that I'll be publishing. Hopefully, it'll come out in the middle of next year. And this is a provisional title. It's maybe a bit of a clumsy title, so maybe it will be somewhat amended. But the police's Ploughmen will definitely stay, because this was the column that headed a number of various columns in newspapers around Britain at the time. Police as Ploughmen, and then you saw the various areas that were releasing the policemen. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you found that interesting and intriguing.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
really looking forward to discussing it with you.
So I would say your title is in no way clumsy. The Police's Ploughmen, I think as an opening title, it's very intriguing because I actually want to ask you some questions around that. And there was a question in the chat from Kira who had to leave about the participation of women that I'll touch on in a moment. But to take the chair's prerogative, I would say, could you talk a little bit about, because you talk about, I'll start off with the contemporary relevance. So there's the idea here that during the war or in times of crisis, we do have civic participation from various segments of society. Some are voluntary and others are people who are already in service in other areas of service, so like the police or the army, etc. So there is absolutely a contemporary relevance, because so in typically what I my point of reference is the tendency for states to call the army in. For instance, in Canada, there was a snowstorm in British Columbia, and British Columbia is not known for icy climbs. So typically it's quite moderate even in the wintertime. So there are a few years in like 10 years ago where the army was called in to provide service because there was simply not enough emergency service personnel. But of course, this is during a war, and the army was already called in to do the thing it's called in to do. So you mentioned the idea of discipline, that there were other people who were called in to provide service, but they didn't know the difference between a pitchfork and a hoe, for instance. So what training did the police have to give them that discipline that overcame the other problems that other services were called in that did not quite live up to?
Right. Well, I'm not sure that the police actually trained anybody to come out at that time. I think probably eventually the farmers were training the army people the soldiers who appeared interested and competent and actually wanted to learn. So the farmers were then, once they had sufficient staff, able to spend time training the soldiers that appeared interested. But really, there were very few other people. There were a few from local authorities. There were a few roadmen who also had backgrounds in farming, but they were far fewer than the police and not in every area of work. Local businesses, most of the men had gone to war already. So really, they were scraping the barrel for finding other people. The women came into their own, but this was local women. It wasn't the Women's Land Army. It was local women who were helping out more. And also, some people that came back was retired people working in the local areas, the farming areas, would come and lend a hand. So there was a variety of people. But really trying to make up the numbers was extremely difficult. And I think the farmers did a huge job in actually keeping it all together, really, to produce enough food so that Britain didn't starve.
So Kara's question was, she says, many apologies for having to leave, but thanks for the fascinating presentation, which is quite fascinating. She says, I understand that that there were women patrols in England and Wales during this period. So it touches on what you just mentioned. Did they have any involvement in the food crisis? So to what extent did the women's participation intersect with the, I guess, the police as ploughmen?
Well, they only came on stream once. The Women's Land Army only came on stream from the beginning of 1918, so they weren't around during there were attempts to recruit middle-class women into agriculture, but they were very small numbers, and it really didn't take off in any way until the beginning of 1918. So really a negative impact, I would say, because farmers weren't willing to accept women.
Okay.
They worried about, was it a suitable occupation for women? How were they going to be housed, these single women? Where were they going to be housed? Were they going to be up to all sorts of mischief if they housed them in local areas? All the problems about potential promiscuity and all this sort of thing came to the fore. And farmers took a lot of persuading to actually use women. Once they'd started to use women at the beginning of 1918, they actually found they were very good. But initially they rejected them, and there was a lot of newspaper coverage about farmers rejecting women, and the agricultural committees, local agricultural committees, talked to farmers at length about trying to persuade them to use women, but really they were very skeptical at the beginning.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I was going to ask why the resistance to women's participation. So I think it's interesting that you've listed a number of reasons, including the sort of typical moralistic rationale for women's participation generally in the public sphere. So the whole idea of having women unchaperoned, but with with the kind of participation that would give them some sort of autonomy to be out and about in public spaces, to be independent, potentially. You mentioned here about pay, right? So to what extent did that impact this whole idea of I don't know, I don't know if you've touched on this in your research, but this idea of participation and compensation and independence, and therefore this kind of gendering of roles as a result. How much did that impact on this whole idea of women's participation?
Right. Well, certainly women were paid, and of course they were paid lower than the men anyway. But that didn't seem to affect them. They were involved, as I say, from the beginning of 1918, and they were very conscientious. They worked very well, and the farmers gradually did get to accept them. And the pay was from the farmers, so the farmers had to pay. But in fact, once government gave a minimum price for the growing of wheat and oats and potatoes, farmers did very well out of the war. Out of the three groups, the farmers, the farm labourers, and the landowners, the farmers did the best. They actually were quite well off during the war, so they could afford to pay staff. And the women, of course, were paid less than the men anyway. So they would have, once they were accepted, they would have been more attractive than the men. And they
Where do
did
you
all sorts of work, as you know. They did a wide variety of different roles anyway.
where do you see the largest number of female participation during this crisis?
The largest participation, oh, was undoubtedly soldiers.
Soldiers.
Soldiers
So
were huge numbers. Yeah, there were tens of thousands of soldiers throughout the country, because later on, once this initial problem of the inappropriate men being sent out to the farmers, the army started to look more carefully at who they were sending. So they sent people who were more likely to be able to conduct the work, and gradually the competence of soldiers increased.
okay. So did the farmers have a say in who they chose, or did they were they just receiving what they were given, say, for instance?
Oh, right. Now, this is quite interesting. Yes, in fact, they did. What they did was the war agricultural committees told the farmers how many men they had, and the farmers had to apply for them. And they could then say, yes, they'd like this person or that person. Often they went up to the War Agricultural Committee headquarters and actually chose who they'd like out of those that were on offer. So, yes, they did have a say.
Okay. Mary, who were the farmers? Can you give me the profile of a typical farmer during this time?
Well, farmers were a vast array of different people. There were the vast estates, which were by the landed gentry,
Mm-hmm.
huge
Mm-hmm.
estates.
Yes.
And they tended, this was one of the reasons why there was the problem in Berwick and Roxburgh, because the landed gentry treated the farm labourers very badly, patronizing to them. They made them work huge numbers of hours. Their accommodation in cottages was very poor accommodation. And so the landed gentry had these huge farms, but then there were the medium-sized farms, which grew a variety of, pasture land and arable. And then there were the peasant farmers who had just a few acres of land. So it was all sorts of varieties. And some areas were like Norfolk, very fertile land to grow crops. Others were hill farms, which grew a few crops, but also mainly had sheep on the hills, and therefore shepherds were important, to look after the sheep. So a wide variety across the country. The east of England tended to be more focused on agriculture for crops, and the west was more focused on pasture land to graze cattle. But all the farms did almost everything.
Okay, so was there obviously each sort of outcome? So if you're a farmer, whatever you produced was important, right? Because there's a crisis at hand. So there were obviously things that were required for the market for production. So if you were a peasant farmer and you happened to be located in an area that was fertile, were you prioritized in terms of being given support? Or did it was it just a matter of like maintaining the status quo? So the big farms from the sort of former feudal arrangement were given support, whereas the smaller farmers were left up to their own devices. Who were the farmers who were offered support?
Right. It tended to be those that were within a certain distance from the war agricultural committees, because things like lending horses, lending men, you had to actually get them to the farms. So if you were in a really isolated location, the chances of you getting anyone that actually wanted to come and work with you was really quite small.
Interesting.
So the closer you were to a large conurbation like Newcastle or Liverpool or somewhere like that, the more likely you were to have people wanting to go and work with you. There were systems set up whereby local people with cars were asked to transport workers across to the farms. So that helped out a bit. But mostly, if you were in a highly rural area, miles away from anywhere, the chances of you getting much help was quite small.
Quite slim. Okay. I'm also fascinated by the whole idea of compensation. I hadn't thought of this. I assume that the war effort would be based around just giving back, so civic participation. So participants, were they all paid?
The people who helped the farmers,
Yeah, were
yes,
they
yes,
compensated?
they
Okay.
one way or another. As I mentioned, the local authorities, particularly Birmingham and I can't quite remember other areas as well, but most of the areas in England, the local authority continued to pay the police for their work. In Scotland, not quite the same. A lot of the areas said, the farmers are doing very well out of this. Why should we completely support them by sending the police out and paying all their wages? So they often said, well, we'll get the farmers to pay a proportion of the wages.
Okay.
For other areas like soldiers, again, the army paid for the wages of the soldiers that came in. Local people would expect to be paid by the farmer. So there were a huge variety of different ways of paying those that worked on the land.
Okay. I have one final question, and it's about prioritizing food over the food provision over fighting provision. So, I mean, during this time, we talk about the idea of a food crisis, and this was crucial because I think that many of us don't really have a conception of this time period, because during this time, the Boer War had only recently happened. And there were a lot of
Mm.
lessons learned. There were a lot of lessons learned from the Boer War, including the idea of finding appropriate people to conscript. So people who were fit, who were in fighting form, for instance. So what the Boer War revealed was that a vast cross section of the population did not have the right nutrition. So
Mhm.
when the food crisis occurred, were there considerations about just simply producing food to keep the population alive, or were there more nuanced considerations about growing the kinds of products that would enhance the nutrition? Because no one knew when the war was going to end. No one knew. Now we know the war ended in 1918, but no one knew at that time it was going to end then. So were they thinking in more long-term ways so the participants were thinking about like the quality of the food that were produced, the kinds of stuff that were produced?
Oh, well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. Yes, I looked at the nutrition of the population at the time of the First World War, and I was utterly shocked. I mean, about 80% of the population you could say were working class, according to
Mm-hmm.
the Registrar General's categories. And some of the poorest lived on a diet of bread, potatoes, and tea.
Yeah,
And I was utterly shocked that,
yeah,
this was how things were at that time. So nutrition standards were very poor.
yeah,
And the Nutrition Society made out recommendations of the proportion of protein, fats, and carbohydrates in diets that people should be eating. But the poorest were nowhere near the level of protein that was required. So this was a real worry. Yes, I mean the general health of the population was not good to start with without all this. And so you can see when you look at that um, things like we might not now think that bread and potatoes are terribly important, but in those days, bread and potatoes gave the people their carbohydrates necessary for energy.
yeah, yeah.
And you can see that, I mean, sometimes farm laborers were said to eat about 6 loaves of bread a week in order to keep up their physical strength. So that's one part of the equation, but the other part of the equation, the longer term, is that Britain realized that at the end of the war, because a lot of industries had closed down, that there was going to need to be a reconstruction of society as a whole. And they set aside various portions of land. And one person that I knew came from Preston. And she
Mm,
said, oh, yes, she said there was a section, quite a large section of land set aside near Preston for men who returned from the war to actually take up agriculture as an occupation. So this was quite widespread throughout Britain in thinking about reconstruction after the war. And men were given these plots of land. Probably the soil wasn't terribly good. They were left to uh, plough it themselves and grow whatever they could on it. But at least it was theirs. And, they had it as a gift to be able to make something of it. So I thought this was quite innovative. I mean, it didn't stop the widespread lack of work for
yeah,
a large majority of the population, but it was a good start to help to increase decreased rural depopulation. There was an emphasis on increasing the rural population, and this was one way of doing it after the
yeah.
war, an increase.
I would. I was going to say, I said that was my last question. Actually, the statement that you made just now, actually triggered another final question in my mind. So I was going to ask about lessons from having the police as ploughmen. So the long-term lessons of, so the recognition that first of all, farming wasn't something that could be done by any Tom, Dick, or Harry. It wasn't just something that you could just walk into and be successful, that you had to have some knowledge, right? So, and also with the thinking, the understanding that there were greater issues beyond, like the crisis alerted to more than just the immediate. It alerted something for the longer term planning and thinking about the nutrition and the health of the nation. So having
Absolutely.
lessons from the police as ploughmen, how did that inform the thinking the more longer term thinking, especially going into that interwar period, that period that we didn't call interwar. I'm sure they didn't call it that at the time. We can call it that now, but what lessons did they take away from that to think more long term, knowing that there was something to do with like that, as we say, that appalling nutrition, like the health standards were so low at that time.
Right. Yes, I mean, I actually haven't followed that up, so I'm really not too sure about. I know a lot of the lessons from the First World War were used in the Second World War, and I believe even the food crisis, there was a food crisis, I think, in the Second World War as well. And so I think they learned from, how to use the land efficiently in order to prevent starvation. Um, but I really am not sure what other lessons. Certainly, the continued movement of men and families from the rural areas into the cities, I think, was something that um, was learned as a result of the First World War. But to what extent it was, I'm really not sure. There
Um,
were also, I should say, some good landlords. I mean, they weren't all terrible. They weren't all exploitative of their staff. And for example, one person who was really good was Sir Elwyn Fellows. Now, he was the associate director of the uh, uh, what am I trying to say? The Department of Agriculture.
okay.
And he was a farmer in Norfolk, farmed a large farm in Norfolk. And he renovated all the farm cottages. He paid the wages of the farmers well. He made them, into communities. He provided communities by renovating the churches for them and providing local shops. He was a really good landowner. So they weren't all terrible. But where they were terrible, they were pretty awful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can imagine that there were a lot of historic issues about statuses and about maintaining the status quo, and therefore a lot of issues about exploitation that were built into that. Thank you
Mm.
very much for that. That was very interesting, and I look forward to reading the book. It's not something that you think of in a historic sense. We do understand that the police are called in to provide social services even today. And we have this understand, but this is quite a nuance. This is not a normalized, like the crisis and the war is not a normalized element of policing. It was just like I would think a very specialist, a very like very niche kind of conversation. So it's very interesting to have it to be exposed to this history. And one of the reasons why recording these sessions are so important is just because they have a longer life and can live on,
Mhm.
very much being disseminated. And I understand that people are massive fans of podcasting or whatever the version that this can be boiled down to. So having this available for audiences who can listen later on is most fantastic. So I want to thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording actually.
Oh, well, thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Let me see where we are with recording wise. Yada yada. There.